Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you like this episode, please remember to hit the like button and leave a comment or two, then subscribe and click on the bell to receive notifications of whenever we release new videos. Also, please remember to share them to your social media. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to Slana Lake along the Matanuska River in the Matanuska Valley, just about 100 miles northeast of Anchorage, along the Alaska State Highway 1. The terrain is breathtakingly beautiful as glaciers grace the valleys of the northern slopes of the Chugach National Forest. The local topography includes some medium-sized mountains with forests, bushes, and other plant life covering them clear to the peaks. The pines, firs, and birch trees stand over the tall blueberry, alder, and willow bushes that dominate the forest floor. There are lakes and ponds, streams and creeks, as well as muskeg dotting the landscape, creating a diverse area for Mother Nature to fill biological niches amongst. Common fauna include moose, brown and black bear, sheep and goats, and numerous fur bearers like beavers. Hunting is a huge industry in the state known as the last frontier, and you don't have to go very far out of civilization to find success. This part of the world has winter seasons with very little light followed by summers with very little dark, allowing plant life to grow seemingly before your very eyes. Many records for overly large vegetables have been set in the fertile Matanuska Valley, and add this potential for abundant food from plant sources and seasonal salmon runs, and you get the perfect recipe for very large bears. In the fall of 1972, a taxidermist from New York by the name of Nelson Steimaker hired a guide by the name of Ray Capocella to lead him on a moose and goat hunt. The hunt was successful, and one day, when they flew over the moose kill, the hunters noticed a large brown bear claiming the gut pile. A brown bear will claim a carcass by defecating and urinating on or near the carcass, as well as covering it with soil, sticks, and other debris, and laying on or near it to guard it. The bear was a very large male bear, and the taxidermist knew it would make an incredible mount. The men assembled a plan and set it in motion. They hiked to within about 75 yards of where they knew the gut pile and the bear would be, and set up a spot to observe the bear. The bush was so thick from the summer's growth that only the bear's back and head could be seen easily as it dozed, waiting for its food coma to end. Every once in a while, the men would see the bear swap ends or roll over, but it never did reveal its shoulders well enough to get a good shot. Generally, a shot through the bones of the shoulder on a large brown bear, or probably even a small one, is ideal because it prevents them from getting away and also prevents them from getting you. The men watched for hours, waiting for the bear to stand up or change positions, but it was apparently very sleepy. Toward the second half of the day, the clouds began rolling in and threatened to worsen. The guide decided this was the point where he would try to make something happen. Ray told Nelson that he would go upwind of the bear to try to get the bruin to smell his scent, and maybe that would draw him to his feet, offering a good shot. A headshot was out of the question, as it would ruin any chance at the record books if the bear would qualify. So Ray sneaked his way upwind and began making noise. Ray began barking and screaming and doing the best he could to rouse the drowsy bear, but the animal didn't budge. Ray returned to his client and commented that the bear was either deaf or had sneaked out. Ray again decided to use the wind to bring his scent to the bear to get it to stand after warning the taxidermist not to shoot him instead. Stealthily sneaked to about 100 yards of the bear to Nelson's right. Ray starts to holler and bark and yell again, but still no response. The guide then decides to creep closer to the stand of alders concealing the bear. Suddenly Ray starts yelling, "Take him! Take him!" in an urgent plea for Nelson to shoot the bear. Nelson scans the surroundings and cannot find the bear through his scope. He then begins looking over his scope in an attempt to see the bear, and all he can see is Ray backpedaling quickly, beginning to raise his own rifle. Ray fired his rifle, and that is when the bear became visible to Nelson from the knoll above. At first, Ray and Nelson thought that Ray was about 100 yards from the bear, but the bear was now only about 30 yards from Ray. While they watched the bear slumber, somehow it had changed locations, and neither man had seen it. When Ray sneaked in the second time, he had walked much closer to the bear than he intended. Nelson fired a quick shot at the bear just after Ray's first shot, and neither had a significant effect on the bear. Both men quickly worked the bolt actions on their rifles, but the bear closed in on Ray too quickly, swiping at him and missing. Ray's situation turned desperate as he turned his rifle into a club and brought it down brutally over the bear's head. Through the rifle shots fired by both men and the splintering of Ray's gun stock over the bear's head, it continued to charge the guide, unfazed. Ray had dodged the bear as long as he could before the bear knocked him onto his back by shoving him in the chest with both paws. It quickly clamped its jaws onto his right thigh and dragged him back into the alders toward the moose gut pile it was still guarding. Nelson began running into the alders to defend Ray, but quickly realized he would lose the ability to see a safe distance and reloaded. The leaves and branches completely obscured the attack, but Ray's screams and the growling of the bear as it brutalized him were very clear. Moving for a better view, Nelson could see that the bear now had its teeth buried in Ray's skull and had lifted him up off the ground. It was shaking Ray violently as he screamed for help. His arms and legs flopped limply as his body was thrown back and forth by the enraged bear. As Nelson retrieved more shells, he had noticed the bear had returned to the top of the gut pile it was protecting. It presented a perfect shot, so he lowered his rifle and delivered a bullet to the bear's shoulders, dumping the bear completely off the gut pile. Nelson was certain he had connected in a vital spot and heard the bear growling and rolling around from the alders. The undergrowth in the alder patch completely obscured everything as Nelson held his rifle like a machine gun, ready for the bear to explode toward him at any moment. He wasn't sure where Ray was anymore, and began shouting for him and heard quiet moans and breathing in return. Nelson has no idea where the bear was at this point either. Nelson entered the alder patch, a nervous wreck, but had to find Ray. He found Ray and saw him rolling on the ground with the bear laying behind him about 20 feet. The bear wasn't moving, and Ray was yelling instructions to kill the bear. Nelson fired a bullet into the bear's skull from about 10 feet away, and the bear jumped from the impact and twitched a bit, then lay still. Ray was still terrified from the attack, and Nelson leaned over him and held him in an attempt to calm him down. Ray asked him what all damage the bear had done to him, and he was drenched in blood. Nelson could see scratches all over Ray's face, chest, and back, but nothing gushing blood. Nelson could see obvious teeth marks in Ray's temple from where the bear bit onto his head, and its teeth must have raked across his face as his nose and cheeks were torn up. Ray's face was so crushed that he could not open his eyes, and his jaw would not work. He had to use his tongue to enunciate words. Ray's clothes were completely torn from nearly all of his body, and purple bear claw marks covered his entire chest and back. The bear's claws didn't break the skin, but obviously had damaged his body. It was also clearly bitten on his thigh, where the bear dragged him into the alders initially. The men devised a plan to have Nelson use the radio on the plane to get help, and Nelson nearly sprinted the 3 miles back to the plane after making sure Ray was warm and comfortable. Nelson frantically explained the details and location of the attack and requested a helicopter. Then he waited at the plane for the helicopter, which arrived with an Alaska state trooper and a doctor. The group were soon hovering over Ray, and it didn't look good. He wasn't moving or responding to their presence. The rescue party landed, but it was too late, as Ray was turning blue and rigor mortis was setting in. The state trooper took some photos of the scene, and they loaded Ray into the copter. Once back in Glen Allen, an autopsy was performed on Ray, and they found that his skull was fractured and several of his ribs were broken. Splinters from his ribs had pierced his heart and lungs. There was a fairly lengthy list of potentially fatal injuries to Ray, but a gunshot was not one of them. His friend did not shoot him. An Alaska state biologist returned to the site and examined the bear. He observed that the bear had been shot in each of the right and left shoulders and once in the head. The bear was a large male, estimated to weigh 750 pounds, whose hide squared at nearly 8 feet. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the remote and rugged mountains just north of Yellowstone National Park in southwestern Montana. The granite peaks soar over valleys stuffed with plants and animals. Each season brings its own state of energy as fall season transitions to a slower time. Pine, fir trees, and aspen trees mark out the horizon, and willow, blueberry, and buckbrush hug the lay of the land. In this area, elk, moose, deer, sheep, and goats adorn the hillside, and black and brown bear, cougars, wolves, coyotes, and bobcats stalk the shadows. In September of 1995, the Schaefer family were on their last day of muzzleloader hunting for elk on Horseshoe Mountain in Montana. None of the hunters have successfully harvested anything yet, but the group is optimistic today is their day. Horseshoe Mountain is a 10,000-foot peak that lies just north of Yellowstone National Park and is surrounded by remote and rugged wilderness. As the hunters climb to the peak of the mountain, they can see the distant clouds of a storm blowing in. They spread out a bit to push through the timber and agree to meet back at camp at the bottom of the mountain for dinner. Bram is at the far end of the line of hunters and is an energetic high school football star who just graduated from high school the prior spring. He heads over a nearby ridge and separates himself from the group, trying to get into a different area than they had previously covered. Bram is cocky and strong in his youth and quickly gets into some promising elk habitat. He starts to see some older elk sign, but nothing exciting. As he looks around for more recent tracks, he notices that the birds are not singing, and the usual forest sounds are all quiet. He begins to feel a sense of impending disaster, and he suddenly sees a huge grizzly bear speeding toward him, growling, drooling, and popping her jaws as she surges toward him. Bram had inadvertently walked right between a sow grizzly bear and her cub, as they were guarding a nearby elk carcass they were feeding on. As the sow blurs toward him, Bram yells for her to stop and tries to get out of her way, thinking maybe she'll run past him and leave him be. The sow sprints straight up to him and shoves him to his back with her paws like an NFL lineman. The sow shreds Bram's down jacket and blaze-orange hunting vest as she digs her 2.5-inch canines deeply into his shoulder. Then she paws him across the head and rips his scalp away from his skull. Bram decides he has to fight back and punches the bear in the nose, and she chomps a hole through his thumb joint. It is a one-sided fight at best, but Bram has no choice and fights for his life. Bram searches for his muzzleloader frantically and sees the enraged bear is now sitting on it. She puts her massive head on his lap and huffs her anger at him several times, as if telling him to stay away from her cub. She opens her enormous mouth, filled with long yellow teeth, and bites into Bram's right thigh and lifts him off the ground. She thrashes her head around, tossing him back and forth several times. When she does this, she tears open a huge chunk of his muscle and tissue from the bone and rips it down toward his knee a few inches. She then slams him to the ground, and he plays dead. The sow then walks a short distance away and continues to watch Bram to see if he is still a danger to her and her cub. Bram tries to lay still and slowly grabs his muzzleloader and points it in the sow's direction. She sees the movement and starts to return to finish him off, but Bram somehow squeezes off a shot. The bullet placement is lucky and drops her dead instantly. Bram is still trying to make sense of this terrifying and rapacious attack. As he begins inventorying his injuries, his shoulder hurts very badly, and he feels his head and replaces a portion of his displaced scalp. He is covered in blood and feathers. Pieces of his hunting vest litter the area around him. He slowly works his way to his feet, but collapses. His right thigh is shredded. It looks like large pieces of meat hanging from his wound, and he can see his femoral artery pulsating, now exposed to the air. He painstakingly pushes the meat and skin back into place and growls with pain as he tightens a makeshift tourniquet from his hunting vest. He knows he needs help immediately, so he raises his pistol and fires 3 shots in succession. This is the understood signal between hunters that someone needs help, but Bram hears nothing in return, as rain quickly begins to fall. The storm from the horizon is now rolling in full force. It brings with it 30-mile-per-hour winds and a constant cascade of chilling rain. Bram knows there is no one near him and that he has to save himself. He slowly wobbles to his feet again and uses his muzzleloader as a crutch. Slowly he steps and winces in pain each time. Pain is shooting through his body, but thankfully numbed a bit from adrenaline. His camp is over the hill on the other side of the mountain, so Bram decides to try to go around the mountain, as he cannot climb it. Bram realizes the desperation of his situation and begins to get angry. The madder he gets, the easier it is for him to move, so he cusses and yells for help, and he slips and limps his way around the mountain in the pouring rain. As the hours pass, the temperature drops to around 10 degrees, and Bram shivers as he struggles for his life. Back at camp, Bram's hunting party slowly filters in from the hunt, and everybody is accounted for except Bram. The group considers perhaps he shot an elk, but nobody heard a shot. They discuss how he's in amazing physical shape and should have beaten everyone back. He doesn't get lost easily, so this is uncharacteristic of him. Dennis, Bram's father, musters the hunters together, and the group head up the mountain together in search of Bram. They yell and fire their pistols, trying to get him to answer back, but the wind and rain kicked up in the storm muffle their attempts. Dennis has some peace of mind knowing he trained his son's survival skills, but is growing more concerned by the minute. The hunting party is concerned that Bram has fallen and injured himself and can't move. As they shiver and holler their way through the rain and thunder and lightning, the futility of their efforts finally set in. The hunters convince Dennis to return to camp and resume the search in the morning light. He initially refuses, but finally relents and emotionally breaks down back at camp in fear of the fate his son is facing. Earlier in the day, and a few hundred yards around the mountain from where Bram was attacked, father and son Bruce and Bryce Pisecki came upon some very recent bear scat and tracks. This immediately unnerves Bruce, as they are only hunting with muzzleloaders, which have a single shot. In order to shoot again, you have to pour in the powder and shove a bullet down and pack the load tight and replace the firing cap. This process can take the best shooters around a minute under the best of circumstances. Surprising a grizzly bear is not the best of circumstances. Bruce and Bryce decide to drop straight down the hill to the Rock Creek trailhead and leave the area in an attempt to avoid the bear. As they're heading down the mountain, the men talk loudly and make as much noise as they can to alert any bears that they may come across. The weather turns bad an hour or so later, and the light of day fades, with the men still searching for the trailhead. As they stumble and slip their way through the stormy darkness, they eventually find the Rock Creek trailhead and sit down to take a break. Bruce voices his concerns that the muzzle loaders they are carrying may not even work in all this rain, so he aims his at a tree and fires it. It worked. The report of the shot is muffled by the wind, but is still loud. Unbeknownst to Bruce, Bram is just a short distance away, shivering and suffering in the rain and dark, as he still works his way around the hill. He's only traveled a few hundred yards, but is now energized with hearing the report of the shot. Bram lifts his pistol and fires an answer to Bruce's shot. Hearing the answering shot, Bruce thinks he's found his friend Dave, a member of their hunting party, and starts to yell at him, inviting him over. Bruce listens for a response, and the wind carries the reply perfectly to him. "I've been attacked by a bear, and I need help." The voice he hears is desperate and is clearly not Dave. The Piseckis start to climb toward the voice, cautiously, as they are afraid the bear may be near. Bruce takes out his pistol and flashlight, and locates Bram standing in the rain with steam rolling from his body. Bruce is shaken by the terrible sight of Bram. He asks the young man where the bear is, and he replies that he killed it. Bruce reassures Bram that he is going to help him. Bruce is a painter by trade and spends his days climbing and balancing on ladders, so he's in pretty good shape. He stoops over and hefts Bram onto his shoulder and begins walking down the trail back toward the Rock Creek trailhead. Bruce quickly tires and has to set Bram down and catch his breath every few yards or so, but he refuses to quit. As Bruce struggles to pack Bram down the trail, he feels the young man getting worse. Bruce stops and wraps his raincoat around Bram to try to preserve his heat and keep him alive. As the trio proceeds sporadically down the trail, the distance between required rests gets shorter and shorter. Bruce is becoming exhausted. He's now sweating in the cold rain and knows this could lead to him getting hypothermia. Bruce is inspired to call out to God for help and pulls his pistol out and fires off 3 last rounds into the air out of desperation. Bruce picks Bram up one more time and begins the cycle of walking and resting again. After a short distance, Bruce is exhausted and cries out to God for strength one more time. He bends over and picks Bram up over his shoulder, but this time Bruce feels strong and pain-free. He's actually able to carry Bram easier now, and thanks God for the blessing. After a short while, Bruce feels Bram's condition worsening again. He sets the young man down on his own feet and wakes him up several times during the hike and watches him fade in and out of coherence. It's then that Bryce yells as he sees approaching flashlights. When Bruce fired the last 3 shots of his pistol, fellow elk hunter Andy Wolf was relaxing in his tent nearby, waiting out the storm. At first, Andy thinks some fool is shooting at an elk in this weather, but realizes the 3-shot signal. He quickly assembles a small rescue team and heads out in the direction of the shots. About 45 minutes into their hike, the rescue party runs right into the Piseckis and Bram. Andy Wolf is an avid hunter and outdoorsman, but the most significant aspect about Andy is that he's a medical doctor trained in shock trauma. Dr. Wolf and his party assist in getting Bram back to a tent to receive medical help. As he begins examining Bram, Dr. Wolf looks at the deep bite into his shoulder and then looks over the scalp wound. Nothing too bad there, so he starts looking at Bram's thigh wound and is immediately very concerned. He sees the initial onset of gas gangrene and watches Bram's femoral artery pulse just a few inches away. This is concerning because gas gangrene can grow up to 6 inches per hour, and if it reaches his femoral artery, it may rupture it. Bram could bleed to death in a few seconds if Dr. Wolf could not stop the bleeding. Two members of the hunting party are immediately sent out for help as Bruce and Dr. Wolf tends to Bram's wounds all night long, keeping him awake and out of falling into shock or coma. Dr. Wolf changes dressings on Bram's injuries and admires how tough the young cowboy is. Bruce quietly goes outside and has a short emotional breakdown from the intensity of the recent hours. As the sun slowly brightens the horizon, a helicopter breaks the peace of the morning with the chopping sounds of its rotors. The two men were successful in finding help. They load Bram into the copter and they head toward the hospital. Bruce sends a friend of his to search for Dennis to convey the good news. Dennis is yelling and searching for his son when he hears someone fire the shot pattern for success. 3 quick shots followed by a single shot. He breaks down in tears of joy as the men head back to camp and depart to be with Bram. Bram was in the hospital for 18 days fighting for his life and was able to keep it and his leg. The physicians told him the bad news that he would never be able to ride a horse again, but the young cowboy proved them wrong and was back in the saddle within 2 months. Bram is fully recovered from the grizzly bear attack that nearly cost him his life, and now has a little son, who he plans to take hunting up on Horseshoe Mountain with a muzzleloader for elk. Some people are just too darn stubborn to die. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Shoshone National Forest in northwest Wyoming. The area consists of rocky crags composed of granite. Peaks soar to over 12,000 feet in elevation, and the pine and fir forests retreat in this alpine environment. The valleys showcase green meadows speckled with ponds and streams and lakes. Wildlife abounds, with moose, elk, and deer sampling the greenery, and wolves, bears, and cougars stalking the shadows. This place is a sportsman's paradise, but hidden dangers are aplenty on these slopes. 62-year-old Ron Leeming and his 37-year-old son, Ron Jr., have spent a few weeks each of the last several years archery hunting for elk near Boulder Basin. The 15-mile pack ensures that they are nearly always alone and have the land and the animals to themselves. It is a time of bonding, shared over 3 generations, but this trip poses a threat that could bring that tradition to a tragic end. Each year they manage to camp in the same location and stay up beneath the night sky dappled with stars. Commemorating previous adventures and curiosities, the men grow their bond stronger and pursue their favorite game animal, bull elk. To hunt elk, one of the men will set up in an ambush position with his bow and arrow, while the other operates an elk call to bring in challengers to a perceived rival. The challenge of convincing one of the most wary animals in the continent to come into archery range is a pursuit that develops a bond that transcends time. Being located in such a remote area is not without its risks. The previous year, Ron ruptured a tendon in his arm while putting his saddle on his horse. This injury left his arm in severe pain and prevented him from drawing his bow, effectively ending his hunting for the year. After returning home, a surgery was successfully performed to repair the tendon, but the rehab and healing process took a very long time. By the time he was okay to resume archery practice, he had lagged in his abilities to the point where he was worried that he could even fully recover. When the season finally rolled around, he had built up just enough confidence to participate. Ron and Ronnie had 2 very different success levels in their hunting experience. Ronnie had taken several elk in prior years, while his father had a distinct history of missing shots at critical junctures. This year alone he had missed twice, and was hoping to make up for it in his next opportunity. On the morning of September 12, 2008, as the duo prepared to head up the trail to hunt, Ron said a quiet prayer for success. He was feeling like he may be too old to play a young man's game, and wondered if his best days hunting were behind him. He asked God to guide his arrow, and recognized the futility of such a selfish prayer. Given what was about to unfold, his request was timely, and answered perfectly. The 2 men made their way through the morning twilight to one of their favorite hunting spots, they referred to as the Rock. A long series of cliffs with clustered timber stands gave them both a limited escape route for the game they pursue and the opportunity to see it. In order to hunt this broken territory, where swirling winds carry your odors to nearby noses, they were wearing elk urine to disguise their scent. Their camouflage clothing helped conceal them from wary eyes while they slowly picked their way through the low sagebrush. They'd discussed the tactics they were planning on using at this place, and Ronnie took his position about 40 yards or so higher up on the hill than his father. He then began calling for elk. He called for about a half an hour when the men noticed that a bull had broken from cover below them and was now moving toward the ambush point near Ron. It approached to just over 80 yards, and just out of range for Ron to shoot it with his bow. It began to work over a small sapling with its antlers as a demonstration of its toughness. Ronnie continued to call and try to entice the bull closer with more challenges using his elk bugle. As he called, he heard a rustle in the bushes just behind and downwind of him. It was a smaller bull, called a raghorn. The bull smelled Ronnie's scent on the breeze and immediately bolted. The big bull was still raking his antlers on the small tree, though, so Ronnie continued trying to work him into position for his father to shoot him. The big bull slowly began to make his way closer to Ron and was only about 35 yards away. The wind was perfect and led their scent in the opposite direction from the bull. Just as Ron was getting ready to draw his bow, the bull bolted before the elder could get a shot sent. Ronnie was perplexed as to what could have sent the bull into such a panicked exit. It couldn't have smelled the men, and they didn't make any sudden movements that would give them away. It was at that moment that Ronnie stood up and turned around. Where the small bull was previously, now a large male grizzly bear emerged from the brush. The 11-year-old 500-pound bear rippled with muscle as it strode from cover and briefly sized Ronnie up. Its dark coat hid it well in the shadows and earth tones of the surrounding terrain. After only a few seconds, the bear was covering the ground between it and Ronnie with alarming speed. He could see the eyes of the beast focused on him as it pumped its claws toward the ground, reaching further each time as it picked up speed. The bear had heard the elk calls from the lemmings, as well as the other two bulls. It came in fully expecting to see one of its favorite prey animals, and those predatory instincts are very hard to extinguish. Now the lemmings had decided, when they were picking their gear up for the trip, that weight would be important. In order to cut down on their pack load, they had decided to leave some heavier and probably unnecessary items at home. 2 of these items turned out to be extremely important on this trip: bear spray and a firearm. Now facing the charging bear, Ronnie only had his bow to protect him, and considered drawing down on the bear as it approached. The bear was upon him so quickly that all he had time to do was jump out of its way. The bear streaked past Ronnie, but quickly turned to continue its pursuit. Ronnie next used a tree for brief cover as he bolted downhill and away from the bear. Yelling at the bear as he ran, it wasn't long before the bear and Ronnie were approaching Ron. Right behind Ronnie, his father could see the massive bear focused in pursuit of his son. The thought of his son being mauled flashed through his mind, as did fond memories of his son's infancy and childhood. His protective ire was roused, and he knew he had to stop this right away. Now, the struggles they'd faced the past year with his injury and missing shots at elk were nowhere near his mind. As Ronnie ran toward his father, Ron drew his bow back and pointed his arrow at the charging bear, with his feet planted firmly on the ground. From Ronnie's perspective, he could see his father as he approached him. He saw Ron draw back his bow, and even saw the arrow zip past his legs only a few feet away. He was so intent on escape, he didn't bother to turn to see if the arrow had hit its mark or skipped harmlessly across the ground. The bear caught Ronnie and pushed him to the ground. Rolling over onto his back, Ronnie punched and pushed the bear in a feeble attempt to defend himself. He knew he had to keep the bear's jaws from getting anywhere near his face, neck, and head. The bear clamped its jaws onto his elbow, which was crushed under the force of a single bite. As the bear swatted him back and forth, Ronnie was tossed all over the place in a confusing scene of flashing teeth and slashing claws. Somehow the bear had swatted him in such a way that Ronnie found himself up on his feet. The pain he should have felt was dulled by all the adrenaline his body was dumping into his bloodstream, and as people in dangerous situations tend to do, his mind quickly found a possible solution. He sprinted toward a tree with a fork in its trunk. Hoping he could wedge himself into the crotch of the tree and find protection, Ronnie bolted toward it. He didn't quite make it into the crotch of the tree, but was caught by the bear right at the base of it. The bear bit and tore at his hand and his back as had him pressed into the ground. Ron reached for another arrow as he watched the shape of the massive bear completely obscure his son. He knew he couldn't shoot at it, as it would be too risky and put Ronnie's life in even more danger. From deep inside him, Ron could feel a primordial anger well up. He ran over to the bear and began to beat on it with his bow. He struck the bear's head and back repeatedly until it turned Ronnie loose. Just then the attack stopped, and the bear turned away a bit. It slowly and clumsily began to stagger down the hill. Ronnie yelled for his father to shoot it again, but Ron was afraid of further angering the bear and had no idea the true magnitude of the wounds he'd inflicted on the bear. The body language of the bear told the experienced hunters that it was in big trouble and didn't want any more to do with them. It staggered just a few more steps and tipped over dead where it lay. Unbeknownst to either of the men, Ron's shot placement, whether luck, divine intervention, or marksmanship, had severed a major artery near the bear's heart and gashed its heart muscle. Ronnie was covered in blood, and his surroundings started to blur and spin as he began entering shock. The bear spent more than a few dreadful seconds on Ronnie near the base of the tree, but hadn't managed to bite onto more than his elbow and hand. Nothing major seemed damaged badly, aside from some nasty bear claw marks on his back and face. That is when the men figured out that all the blood Ronnie was covered in had come from the wound his father's arrow had inflicted on the bear. As it frantically tried to kill Ronnie, it had coincidentally sprayed its blood all over him. He was still a nervous wreck, but he wasn't mortally wounded. Ron quickly began to build a fire in an attempt to ward off Ronnie's shock. The trail ride out was 15 miles of the most difficult and treacherous riding a man could do, even when he was healthy and unhurt. Ronnie was fading in and out of coherence and presence. Their cell phones were unable to pick up a reliable signal, and they knew no one would be expecting them for several more days. They really had no choice. They had to pack up their horses and ride to get Ronnie medical help. After they were ready to leave, the irony of the roles being switched as Ron helped Ronnie into his saddle came to their minds. It took the Leemings 6 hours of hardscrabble horse riding until they ran into Carl Sauerwein, who was headed up Boulder Creek to his own elk hunting camp. Carl saw the pair from a distance, and they were familiar from prior years' hunts, so he yelled out a greeting toward them. He could see Ronnie was bundled up in layers, despite the warmth of the day. As Carl approached the pair, Ronnie calmly stated that he'd just been mauled by a bear, and they were going back to get medical help. Carl could see the blood and scratches on Ronnie's face, but also noted he didn't appear to be in too bad a shape. The father and son simply tipped their hats to Carl as they rode by and continued their descent. After such an intense event, the 6-hour horse ride had Ronnie thinking about priorities and what hunting meant to him. He was assessing how risky it is, but also considered what it meant to him and his father over the years. He knew in his heart that they would be back to hunt here again. As they headed down the trail, a bull elk bugled just a few hundred yards from the trail they were on. Ronnie urged his father to go shoot it, but his father said he probably couldn't hit it. Ronnie quipped that if he made that elk chase him, he bet Ron could hit it. Ronnie was treated for puncture wounds and released from the hospital the same day. He made a full recovery and still enjoys the outdoors. Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider liking the video and subscribing to our channel. Clicking the bell icon will let you know when we post new videos, and sharing our videos to your social media platforms helps spread awareness. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode is called The Man-Killing Grizzly Known as Twotoes, and takes place in the still very primitive location near Yellowstone National Park. The year was 1912, and it was a bright, warm day in May near Crevice Mountain in southwest Montana. A 63-year-old prospector by the name of Johnny Graham was crossing the creek when his favorite pack horse stumbled. She fell flat on her side and had a hard time regaining her feet. Johnny pulled at the reins and yelled at her, "Come on, come on," trying to encourage her to get out of the creek. Finally, she stumbled from the creek and onto the bank, but was in terrible shape. Johnny looked down at her crooked leg and knew she was done. He sorrowfully marched her a few yards off the trail and pulled out his hunting rifle. The single shot dispatched her mercifully, as the old gold miner knew she would never recover from such a horrendous injury. A few days later, Johnny was returning from his claim to his cabin, a short distance from where he dispatched his pack horse, when he noticed the largest grizzly bear he had ever seen. He figured this big bear was headed to the remains of his pack horse and watched cautiously to see if his suspicions were true. He peeked through the willows and watched a robust and very healthy boar approach the horse carcass and start eating. Being a man of the backwoods, Johnny knew he was too old to stock up on a bear of that size, so he devised a plan. The next day, just after noontime, Johnny knew the bear would be full of horse meat from the carcass, so he carefully crept in and placed a large 60-pound bear trap near the carcass and stealthily crept away. He figured he would give it a few days and see if anything turned up in it. Johnny decided to swing by one day and take a look at the trap, and to his amazement, it was gone. The trap was heavily constructed of thick steel and featured jagged teeth designed into the metal. The trap's absence meant it was either stolen, or the bear tore it loose and walked away with it still attached. Johnny began looking around to read the sign in the area and found some large bear tracks leading away and showing obvious signs of an impaired gait. Johnny warily followed the tracks a little over 200 yards down the hill. Amongst the trees, he saw the giant bear as he struggled against the trap. It was wedged between two fallen trees. Johnny thought quietly to himself how fortunate he was to have such an opportunity at a giant bear like this. He leveled his rifle at the bear and took careful aim. Johnny placed 2 shots to the bear's ribs, and the massive Bruin collapsed and ceased all movement. Johnny triumphantly walked up to the trophy. He leaned his rifle against a nearby tree and unsheathed his skinning knife. This bear's hide was going to make a very nice rug for his den, he thought. As he approached the motionless bear, the massive Bruin sprang to life. In a frenetic burst of motion, it tore itself loose from the steel trap, severing 3 of its toes. Johnny didn't even have time to turn to run, as the bear ripped into him, biting, clawing, and chewing mercilessly, but leaving him alive. The bear's severed toes and 4-inch claws remained behind as Johnny's only trophy, as the bear fled the scene. A short while later, a passerby found the miner in terrible condition and ran to get help after hearing the details of the encounter. The local miners and lumberjacks gathered together with their firearms and headed out to locate the bear before it could do any more damage to anyone else. The hunting party, hell-bent on revenge and eliminating the massive bear, pursued him until he crossed a raging river and entered nearby Yellowstone Park and its safety from hunters. Disappointed, the men knew what they risked had they pursued the bear into the park, and they turned back to check on Johnny. He succumbed to his wounds shortly thereafter. In 1960, Pat Welsh was delivering supplies near Soda Butte Creek, near Yellowstone. One night while sleeping, the 61-year-old woodsman was awakened by the familiar sounds of a bear in camp, raiding his supplies of ham and bacon. Welsh grabbed some pots and pans and clanged them together, trying to scare the bear off, as this wasn't exactly a rare event for the area. The bear was not at all frightened of the clatter, and actually advanced toward the man menacingly. Pat grabbed for the nearest weapon, an axe used for cutting firewood, and started swinging it to back the bear down. The giant grizzly easily swatted the axe from his hands, rendering the man defenseless, and proceeded to tear, bite, and claw Pat from head to toe. Pat's companion grabbed some Roman candles they had and chased the bear off. He tried to take care of Pat, but he succumbed to his wounds within a few days. His friend noted that after the attack scene was checked out in the daylight, the bear was missing 3 toes on his front foot. On the 12th of June 1922, a backwoods outlaw known as Frenchie was setting traps along Slow Creek, right outside of Yellowstone Park, and the stalk had been torn in 2 by the angry Bruin. In the bear's hasty retreat from the scene of Frenchie's mauling, he departed with the trap still clinging to his leg and dragging the chain in the dirt behind. The trap was found about a year later, minus the bear it once clinging to. Old Twotoes was never heard from again.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the dense pine forests of the Slana River just north of the Wrangell-St. Elias National Park and Preserve in Alaska. Along the river is a broad valley in which the river winds and creates a vibrant riparian zone that allows beaver, moose, wolves, and bears to thrive. Though this area is crisscrossed by a few roads and dotted by roadhouses and tiny towns, it is remote. Stepping off of the established travel route places you in the middle of virtually uninterrupted forests and wetlands. In the early 20th century, only the toughest and most independent of souls would call this place home. On August 29th of 1949, an immigrant from Denmark named Knut Petersen spent 26 years of his life mining and prospecting the waters of the Slana River system for gold and uranium. That day he drove his truck down the road to his friend's cabin. Ole Hoagland was a trusted mining companion, and Knut was planning on visiting and asking his friend to go mining with him up the Big Talk River to the north. Knut parked his truck on the gravel highway and started walking down the trail to Ole's place. He had made this trip countless times and never had an incident that he couldn't handle. He hadn't brought his rifle and planned to stay the night at his friend's house before returning in the morning. After discussing the prospecting trip, Ole let Knut know that he simply couldn't go, as he had too much work to do. As Ole began his chores, Knut started the return hike to the highway, and his vehicle parked there. Knut returned on the trail, which was only a few yards from the river it followed. He was excited to get back and start preparing his equipment for his trip. He was a little over a quarter of a mile from Ole's cabin when he was terrified by a deafening roar from the willows behind him. For a moment he was paralyzed by fear, but soon turned in the direction the roar had come from. He was mortified at the sight of an 800-pound, enraged brown bear speeding toward him, eyes focused on him. The giant bear was infuriated and growled and snarled as it closed in on the petrified miner. Canute had seen bears run plenty of times, but the speed of this gargantuan bruin amazed him and relayed the fury of the bear. Canute knew that he couldn't outrun the bear, but hoped that he could jump into the river right next to him. He quickly surmised a plan to hold his breath as long as he could as the muddy river waters hid his escape downstream back toward Ole's cabin. He could swim the rest of the way and the bear would soon forget about him. But that plan was far too ambitious. The bear caught him only a few steps into his escape. The brown bear slapped him on his left shoulder, knocking him flat onto his face in the gravel. The bear sank its 2-inch-long canines into Canute's left arm and bit it to the bone. The bite nearly severed his arm and rendered it useless in his defense. Canute flipped onto his back to try to kick the bear, but the beast immediately tried locking its jaws onto his face before he could react. Canute hollered as loudly as he could for Ole and slapped the bear across the nose with his right hand in a futile attempt to defend himself. The bear was so fast that it crunched onto his right hand and wrist before Canute could even pull his hand back. The bear then focused its attack on his right thigh and bit it to the bone as well. The bear's teeth tore and ripped his thigh like a knife through hot butter. It chewed on his thigh while holding him down with its left paw positioned on his gut, while the man yelled for his friend to help him. The bear next slapped Canute's left calf and ripped it wide open with a single swipe. It then flipped him over by digging its claws into his back and ribs, gashing flesh and skin alike. Canute tried to belly crawl into some nearby alder, but the bear slashed him on the back of his head, severing a 3-inch patch of his scalp completely. The bear then bit into his neck, and Canute could feel his vision fading as his air and blood supply to his brain was pinched by the pressure of the bite. The bite increased the blood pressure in his head so much that he could feel it. The next thing Canute could remember seeing was the bear's enormous mouth as it again focused on his head. The bear clamped onto the lower half of his face and crushed his jawbone, knocking 4 teeth out with a piece of jawbone. It broke the upper plate of his dentures in 2. The bite severed his nose and upper lip as well. The bear threw an absolute fit on the man, grunting and growling and huffing in rage for the better part of a minute. Then it disappeared. The silence was such a contrast to the noise of the attack that Canute was unsure if he was still alive. He sat there for a short time trying to gather the depth of what had just happened. He inventoried his wounds as best he could and was covered from head to toe in his own blood. His clothes were tattered, and the only section intact was his belt line and waist of his pants. All of his other clothes were torn from him during the attack. He was covered with cuts and gashes, and his right wrist was obviously broken. The meat of his right thigh was completely separated from his leg, but still scantily attached. His left bicep muscle was torn loose from his arm and rolled up toward his elbow. His face was an utter mess, and his windpipe was exposed from the bite to his neck. He wasn't sure if it was even possible to get back to Ole's cabin, and tried to crawl initially, but his broken wrist made it impossible. He struggled to his feet, but couldn't walk with his right thigh so severely damaged, so he sort of hopped on his left leg as best he could. As he staggered through the brush, his blood seeped from his face into his windpipe, causing him to choke and cough. He bent over trying to clear his airway of blood, but the blood from his face then flowed into his eyes, temporarily blinding him. He didn't care if the bear was following him or not, as if there was a subsequent attack, he knew he would not survive it. His best bet was to push on toward Ole's. As he approached Ole, he could see and hear his friend sharpening tools on a small grinder. He didn't want to startle Ole, but he couldn't speak, so he let out a grunt, which was drowned out by the grinder. He grunted even louder, and Ole turned around, and his expression told Canute everything he needed to know. Ole later would indicate that he only recognized Canute's eyes, as nothing else was familiar. As Ole stared at Canute, he muttered, "Oh, Christ, Canute, what happened? A bear?" Canute nodded his head and pointed to the cabin. His friend helped him inside and prepped a mattress for him to lay on. Canute tried to say goodbye to his friend, but couldn't utter any intelligible words due to the injuries to his face. Canute comforted his friend, grabbed his rifle, and left for help. Ole ran the mile to his truck on the highway and made it the 4 miles to the Alaska Road Commission camp within 17 minutes. Given that he was over 60 years old, he made amazing time. At the camp, the authorities were notified and a small rescue crew was assembled to save Canute's life. Back at the cabin, Canute stood to his feet and looked in the mirror. His face was sloughed over to the side, and he knew this was something that he wasn't sure he would ever recover from. He laid back on the mattress, but started to get cold from shock. He decided to light a fire in the wood stove, but the blood from his injuries continually extinguished the flame. He was so distorted he couldn't even smoke a cigarette. He tried to write a will and testament on a calendar, leaving everything to his brother Ole. Canute soon heard the voices of his rescuers outside the cabin. The men carried him on the mattress and put him in a boat to take him downstream closer to a road. The men carried him from the craft to a vehicle, and he used his hands to hold his face together enough to ask them if their efforts were even worth it. They reassured him that he would survive. An army doctor administered morphine just before they loaded him into a plane to fly the World War I veteran to a military hospital on Elmendorf Military Base in Anchorage. The men returned to the scene and found Canute's severed scalp, but it was beyond saving. 2 soldiers donated blood for Canute, and surgeons worked for several hours trying to patch him back together. The surgeons had to discard the portion of his thigh muscle that was torn loose, as it could not be salvaged. Dirt, pine needles, and bits of clothing were removed from his injuries before they sutured them shut with 418 stitches. Despite a grim prognosis, Canute regained the use of his right arm and his leg within about 4 years. He stayed in the hospital for 3 months, and his missing scalp grew a thin layer of scar tissue over it in about 2 years. It was frail and would be ripped open easily, but that was better than having an exposed skull. Canute was filled with a vengeance toward bears after that, and recommended that people shoot any bear that shows up around their cabin. The bear was a huge, healthy bear of undetermined sex, and the presence of cubs was never confirmed. The bear was not shot and remained unharmed to the best of the research I uncovered.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes place near Grand Mesa, Colorado, and is more of a story about a freakishly large bear than an aggressive bear. Old Clubfoot, as the bear had been known by, wandered the area dining off of local provisions that were not his own. He was a gentle giant, I guess, but didn't understand the implications of his gluttonous pursuits. In the 1880s, ranchers near Grand Mesa, Colorado, were noticing cattle that had been killed by a grizzly bear. The bear had always eaten his fill, then moved on, and never returned to the same place. He was a very large, smart bear, and hard to predict for the ranchers. In the year 1890, the bear was caught in a trap, which was the prevailing way to catch a bear long enough to be shot. The trapper would be permitted the opportunity to dispatch the bear while it was encumbered in the trap, limiting damage to the trapper. A large grizzly was caught in this trap and managed to get away, -3 of his toes. This identified the bear at all future cattle predation, as his signature two-toed track was present. His track resembled a club, and that was the origin of his nickname. In 1902, a small hunting party had decided to hunt near Grand Mesa, as was common at the time, as the fishing and hunting were excellent. Franklin Mangus, who was a spry 61-year-old man, decided to stay back at camp, as he was relatively new to hunting. Mangus took his .30-30 deer hunting rifle and stayed close to camp, looking for a deer for camp meat. Franklin was walking along a trail near camp when he heard a loud woof behind him. He slowly turned and felt the hair on the back of his neck stand erect. A very large grizzly bear was walking toward him in a non-threatening manner. Franklin froze in fear and wasn't sure what he should do. The bear peacefully strode past him, but when it was about 20 yards away, Franklin decided to shoot it. The report of the rifle rang out, and Mangus expected to see the massive bruin piled up. Instead, he watched as the big bear just ran off. Franklin knew he couldn't just leave the bear and started trailing the tracks. He followed the bear several miles and was crossing a stream to find the bear's tracks on the other side to continue the pursuit. Suddenly he saw the giant rise from the bushes a little over 100 feet from him on his hind legs. Franklin quickly shouldered his rifle and fired. The bullet found its mark in the bear's shoulder. He worked the lever on his firearm and fired again. At that point, the bear turned and retreated into the nearest cover of willow bushes. Franklin worked his way around the willow stand, and the bear exited just about 25 yards from him. The bear lowered its head and charged the man. Franklin worked the action of his rifle and fired as quickly as he could, dumping bullets into the bear to stop the attack. The bear fell and ceased its movement, and the hunter realized the struggle had ended, at least for now. Franklin left the location and returned to camp to tell the other hunters of the encounter. He ate dinner and discussed the bear's location to recruit help in recovering the animal for harvest. The recovery party hiked the long distance to the location Franklin indicated the carcass would be,
but were surprised when they got there. The bear was gone. They started looking around the area to locate any sign of where the bear had gone and followed his tracks about 100 yards to a nearby willow grove. Franklin fired his 12th shot into the back of the bear's skull to finally bring the ordeal to an end. The remarkable part of the story is the reported size of old Clubfoot. He weighed in at around 1,600 pounds, which is a gigantic bear for an interior grizzly. When the hunters looked his hide over, they counted 12 shots that penetrated his thick protective hide, but only 2 of the bullets penetrated the protective fat layer beneath his hide. Old Clubfoot's hide measured 8 foot 4 inches squared, which means from nose to tail and front paw to front paw. The massive bear's hide is still in the possession of Franklin's family and was temporarily displayed at various points of interest in surrounding towns, as well as the World's Fair in St. Louis in 1903.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the majestic Rocky Mountains near the headwaters of the Navajo River. The San Juan Wilderness area is a rugged combination of forest and granite peaks ranging in elevation from around 8,000 to 12,000 feet. The valley's flush with deer, elk, coyotes, and black bear, but the ecological niche of the grizzly now goes unfilled. On the eve of September 23, 1979, Colorado native and hunting guide Ed Weisman slips quietly through the forest as the day of elk hunting winds down. Ed thinks of himself as a bit of a throwback mountain man who enjoys living as close to nature as he can get. That is why he enjoys archery hunting. It beckons to something primordial in his spirit. Mike Neatery is the 25-year-old hunting partner of Ed and is about 300 yards from his hunting partner looking for an elk. The Kansan handles the steep terrain well and enjoys their time in the mountains. He glances ahead and sees what he thinks is a large black bear. The bear lifts its nose to the breeze and gets a good sniff of Mike and heads down the draw toward Ed. Ed hears a rustling in the bushes nearby. As he turns to take a good look at what is making the bushes shake so much, a 400-pound female grizzly erupts from the bush and steams toward him. He immediately recognizes her as a grizzly, but knows they haven't been observed in Colorado in over 27 years. The sow closes the short distance before Ed can do anything other than drop to the ground and pretend to be dead. This is what the textbooks and professionals say to do, after all. He thuds to the ground, but apparently this bear is not fooled by his acting performance. She immediately clamps her jaws onto his right leg and bites over and over several times, tearing his pants, skin, and flesh severely. Next, she bites into his right shoulder with her 2.5-inch canines, puncturing tissues to the bone and creating massive wounds wherever she bites. Ed feels his flesh being torn, and the pain is electrifying. When the sow continues the attack for more than a few seconds, he realizes he may need to fight for his life. As the rage of her attack continues, Ed takes inventory of any possible weapons in his area. He's an avid bow hunter and does not carry a firearm, and bear spray is still being developed. He looks to his left and sees his arrows, now knocked from his quiver, laying on the ground within arm's reach. They are good and sharp from the time he spent sharpening before he left camp this morning. Ed reaches over and grasps one of the aluminum arrows and in one fluid motion plunges it into the grizzly's neck like a long dagger. The arrow shaft breaks in two and blood sprays in his face. He hit pay dirt with his first strike, severing the sow's jugular vein. Unfazed by the fatal wound to her neck, the grizzly continues to tear at him with her claws and bite him severely. Ed reaches up and removes the arrow shaft from her neck and plunges it into her chest just behind her leg. This blow strikes her in the heart and causes her to withdraw a short distance. She slowly walks and turns back toward Ed, then lays down and puts her head on her paws. Colorado's last grizzly bear breathes her final breath and finds peace. Mike hears Ed's loud scream, so he hurries to where the two parted company. The only clue he can find is Ed's black wool cap, and it has blood on it. He is immediately concerned for his guide and friend, as it looks like he's been attacked and dragged away by a bear. That is when he hears Ed's cries for help and runs to his companion's side. Ed is in bad shape, very bad shape. He has obviously broken bones, exposed tendons and muscle tissue, and deep gashes over his shoulders and legs. Ed is already working on his own rescue plan and asks Mike to ride his horse back to camp to get help. Life Flight will fly him to the hospital, and all this drama should be over soon. Ed came from tough stock, a steel mill worker for a father and a stoic and tough mother. He was never overly worried about any setback. This toughness will get him through.
The rescue copter arrived just after sunrise, and Ed was flown to the hospital in Alamosa. After a week, he thinks he's ready to be released, but when a doctor removes one of his dressings on his thigh and sticks his entire finger into one of the wounds, he suddenly understands recovery will take some time. The doctor drains the pus and fluids from the wound and repacks the dressing. After 2 more weeks, Ed is released to home care, but just 6 months later guides a client on a cougar hunt, and in a further 3 months returns to the attack site without the assistance of a walking cane. He worked for 20 more years as a Colorado hunting guide. He now works at Walmart to stay busy. He still has the broken arrow shaft and broadhead he used to kill the bear. The bear's pelt and skeleton still sit on the basement of the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, with her skull on display on the 2nd floor. When experts examined her corpse, they discovered that she was around 20 years old and had severe arthritis. She also probably never bore cubs. Ed says he doesn't worry about the attack, he says with a smile, but for those who have yet to be attacked.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the interior of northern British Columbia, Canada, near a small town called Gatineau. The mountains tower above a mile high at their peaks, and the valleys between them are broad and heavily forested. In most of these broad valleys, tangles of willow, alder, and tall grasses screen elk, deer, moose, and woodland caribou. You may even see American bison browsing on grasses, munching their way across meadows. Predators include cougars, wolves, coyotes, and black and brown bears stalk the riparian zones to surprise their prey. It is in this setting that our episode takes place today. On June 26th of 2019, 54-year-old Alex Woods was walking alone near Gixon Village, just a few miles from his village, Gatineau. He was a forest pathologist and was going to check tree roots for a disease known as armillaria root disease in old-growth stands of forest. Alex was a lean-built man who wore his silver beard trimmed short. He had the GPS coordinates all entered into his device, but was an old-school type of guy, so he took a heading and hiked in the general direction. He had spent the last few decades in the deep woods and routinely hunted and floated the rivers. As he walked through the foliage, he noticed a freshly broken stem of a fireweed plant. Knowing this doesn't happen unless a large animal has passed by, he took mental note to pay attention to his surroundings. He began yelling, "Yo, bear," repeatedly to let anything that was around him know he was there. He didn't want to end up in a close-range standoff with a moose, let alone a surprised bear. A few hundred yards into his journey, Alex came up on a steep slope covered in hemlock and balsam fir, burned from a wildfire a year or 2 before, and was open consequently. The small creek at the bottom refreshed plants and animals alike along its banks. Given the noise from the creek, Alex decided to raise his voice while yelling "Yo, bear" as he descended the bank. Just beyond halfway down the slope, he saw some morel mushrooms and plucked a couple for his dinner later. After he picked up the mushrooms and stood, he noticed a black bear running directly at him. It wasn't grunting or growling. The bear didn't have any drool dripping from its lips. It simply sped toward him as if it were going to run straight past him. It closed from about 100 feet when he first saw it and quickly climbed the steep slope toward him, so fast Alex wasn't sure what he could do. Alex quickly maneuvered himself behind a small tree, with a tree laying at its trunk, and began yelling at the bear. He reached his hand into his vest and pulled out his bear spray, figuring that one blast from it would probably send the bear scampering in the other direction. The cap on the bear spray was stuck, and he fumbled with it, trying to get it to function as the bear approached him. The next thing Alex knew, he saw a huge bear head with its mouth wide open and ready to bite into his abdomen. One thing Alex had working for him was the steep slope he was climbing down. As the bear labored up the slope, its head happened to line up for a perfect defensive strike from Alex. He yelled again, then mustered his bravery and kicked the bear as hard as he could, right in the jaw. Between Alex's kick and the steepness of the slope, the bear slid back down the slope several feet. It then began to run around the tree to get at him. As the bear approached him again, Alex yelled louder and kicked it in the head as hard as he could one more time. This really rattled the bear, as it ran to a nearby tree and climbed several feet up and stared at Alex. The man was hoping that this encounter was coming to an end after the brief struggle, but in the world of bears, struggle is always a part of survival. Whenever Alex went into the woods, he carried his father's hatchet strapped into a pocket of his work vest, right near his bear spray. He had always felt it was a good tool to have handy in a pinch, and he was absolutely right this day. After a short staring session, the bear slowly clawed its way back down the tree. As it did so, Alex reached into the pouch on the back of his work vest and pulled out his father's hatchet.
He was hoping the bear would take this moment to run away, but the bear quickly dashed toward him, again to attack with more vigor this time. Alex swung the hatchet with grim intention and sank its sharpened bit deeply into the bear's head. The bear immediately slumped over and rolled down the slope. It laid on its back, but was still breathing. Alex knew better than to believe his eyes when it came to bears, as they are known for quickly regaining their feet and killing people. He was protected, standing behind the tree in the deadfall, and didn't want to give that spot up without certainty. After several minutes of observing the bear, he decided to scramble back up the slope and put as much distance between him and the bear as he could. Alex kept his eyes on the bear as he backed up the slope, then headed directly to his truck. He was still very frightened and continually checked over his shoulder every few steps as he went. Visions of the bear rolling over and regaining its feet drove him to quicken his pace until he entered the cab of his truck. Once Alex returned to town, he called up the British Columbia Conservation Officer Service and relayed the unbelievable story to them. Investigators headed up to the location and found the bear was still alive, but just barely. The bear was immobilized by the hatchet blow, as its skull was opened up. As a humane gesture, the officers put the bear down and ended its headache better than aspirin. The officers returned to town and let Alex know that the bear had cubs, and that may be why she was so defensive. He was still torn up by the information, as he would have never wanted to orphan bear cubs. He rehearsed in his mind how he had done everything that had worked for 35 years in the woods. He yelled and made plenty of noise to make sure the bear would know he was there, but maybe the creek covered up his attempts to be bear aware. Several experts indicated that the sow was demonstrating predatory behavior in her attack of Alex. He was lucky that day. The officers examined the sow and found her to be healthy, and even on the larger side for bears in the area, weighing in at just under 200 pounds. Alex noted that streams were lower this year than previous years, and that may be an indicator of ecological distress in the area. As a warning to other people who visit the woods, Alex says, "You have to make sure to keep your bear spray handy. It won't do you any good if you don't know how to use it or can't quickly access it." He laments that if he'd been able to use his bear spray, perhaps this sow and her cubs would still be alive. Alex says that when he goes into the woods from now on, he will change his approach. He's used to hunting by himself, but isn't so sure anymore. He's concerned that the intensity and danger of this confrontation will stay with him for quite a while. After reviewing the details of this episode, I have a few questions for you. Do you think that the bear was trying to prey on Alex, or did she have other motives? Why weren't her cubs anywhere near her during the attack? Do you think Alex's attempt to alert nearby animals instigated the attack? I wonder what the officers did with her cubs after putting her out of her misery. I enjoy reading your comments, so please post them below and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to southern Siberia, to a province in the Russian Federation called Tuva. This area is poverty-stricken and is renowned for its crime and drug abuse. The temperature here can drop to minus 80 degrees in the winter and soar to over 100 degrees in the summer. The Siberian larch, laurel leaf poplar, and the Scots pine are among the tallest trees here, and kites and kestrels hunt the chi and tufted hair grasses. A few of the common animals here are wolves, snow leopards, mountain sheep, antelope, reindeer, and brown bears. It is in this wilderness setting that our episode takes place. On June 1st of 2019, 29-year-old Nikolai Urgit was headed out into the wilderness near his hometown of Kut with several of his friends to gather horns and antlers that were shed by animals in the winter. Some of the animals that died in the winter would leave behind their horns that could be sold on the black market for money. This activity required a permit issued by the local government, but Nikolai and his friends declined to purchase theirs, as it bit into their profits. In his everyday life, Nikolai was a school caretaker and happy father of 2 sons and 1 daughter he was raising with his 25-year-old wife, Ida. Given the condition of the local economy, Nikolai and his friends couldn't afford firearms, nor bear spray. They didn't even bother bringing knives along with them. They weren't planning for any confrontations in which they may need them, and wouldn't be long in the woods. They'd planned a quick trip and to return to their families by nightfall with their haul. Shortly after arriving at the area they planned to search in, they began to spread out and looked in their own spots for antlers and horns. As Nikolai walked around for a few hours, he began to push his way through some dense brush. He emerged on the far side of the bushes and glanced up. His eyes widened as a massive brown bear filled his vision, glaring at him. The bear was just a few yards away, and Nikolai had walked nearly right up beside the giant bear, which was estimated to weigh around 1,000 pounds.
As soon as their eyes met, the bear flung itself toward the man, letting out an ear-shattering roar as it came. Nikolai clenched his fists and yelled at the bear as it advanced, hoping the bear would bluff charge him, then run away. But if bears operated on our hopes or expectations of them, we would all be safe when we encountered them. The bear didn't bluff charge, but opened its mouth wide and reached out for his arm. Nikolai instinctively punched the bear in the head, but this didn't even make the bear flinch, as it immediately bit onto his forearm and leapt on top of him. The bear quickly bit into his abdomen and tore at his flesh, then moved up to his chest and ripped flesh there. He was careful to point out whenever he relayed this story that the bear never clawed him, but exclusively used its powerful jaws. It apparently wanted to devour him immediately. While being savaged by the angry bear, Nikolai didn't smell anything. He didn't feel anything during the attack. He began to lose any regard for his own life, but thoughts of his children and wife flashed through his mind. He loved them so much and didn't want them to be without him. After the bear bit at his chest, it changed its savage focus to his head. It clamped its massive jaws onto his skull and began tearing his scalp just above his left forehead. One of its canines punched into his left eye orbit, tearing its flesh from the middle of his eyelid back a few inches toward his temple. At that point, Nikolai opened his eyes, and his entire visual field was filled of the bear's huge gleaming teeth closing over the width of his face. As the bear bit into his face, he felt enormous pain shoot through his body like electricity. The man instinctively tensed up in preparation for the pressure of the bear's jaws, and as he did this, he clenched his jaws. The pictures of his wounds are too graphic for YouTube and have been uploaded to our Patreon link, linked below the video. But I warn you, they are not for anyone with a weak stomach. Suddenly the bear roared loudly and ran quickly through the forest away from Nikolai. He continued to roar in a distressed way as he fled. Nikolai's focus now returned to himself and his wounds. His mouth felt strange, and he was certain his lips were torn off and now inside of his mouth, as he could feel his mouth was full of something. He began to move his jaws and felt a chunk of meat moving around in there. He grows certain he's bit off his own tongue in the melee and sits up to spit it out. As he disgorges whatever's in his mouth onto the dirt, he can feel his tongue still in his own mouth. He quickly examines the foreign flesh and realizes he'd somehow bitten a big chunk of the bear's tongue off while it was attacking his face. He observes the severed bear tongue on the ground, now losing its color due to lack of blood flow, and would later describe it as white. Nikolai is shaking from the adrenaline and stress of the event as he checks himself over and assesses his wounds. Between the bear roaring and Nikolai calling for his friends, it doesn't take long for his party to emerge from the brush and gather at his side. The other men organize an impromptu litter and load their friend on top of it for the trip back to their vehicle. Nikolai is quickly transported to the hospital in the capital city of Kyzyl, 90 miles away, where he spends the next month convalescing apart from his family. While being treated with preventative medicines to ward off infection, Nikolai expresses that he misses his wife and children. While in the hospital, a skin graft was taken from his arm and set on his forehead to help it heal quicker. Upon hearing about his harrowing fight with the bear, his wife Ida broke down into tears and was angry with him for going to such a remote and dangerous place. Nikolai is heralded as a local hero by members of his village, but he expresses regret at his scars and the damage done to his left eye during the attack. He reports that he's ashamed to walk down the street as people stare at his scars. His left eye is still not functioning correctly and may never. His neighbors think of him as a hero, but he maintains that he did what he had to do to survive. After gathering and analyzing this information, I'm left with a few questions. Do you think Nikolai would have survived the bear attack if he hadn't bitten the bear's tongue off? Why do you think the bear didn't rake him with his claws? Do you think a firearm or bear spray would have made any difference in this attack? Why did Nikolai describe the bear's tongue as white-colored? Was the bear diseased in some way? It will be great to read your thoughts in the comment section below, so post your ideas and let's talk about it.
Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.